everybody, we're Queerly Christian from Tumblr.com. I'm Leah and I use she, her pronouns.
I'm Avery and I use they, them pronouns.
And today we are going to be talking about what you guys voted on. So we're going to talk a bit about LGBTQ characters from the Bible, from both the Old and New Testament.
So we do kind of want to have the disclaimer, we're not saying that every figure we discuss today is definitely LGBT plus themselves. Some of them could have been, some of them might not have been. There's no way of knowing. They didn't really use these identities back then. But the reason we want to talk about them today is that there are certain figures that we find we can connect to in this special way. We see something in them that resonates with us as LGBT Christians. So we're starting with the very start of the Bible, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, the creation stories, with the figure Adam. So in Genesis 1:27, God creates humanity, and the word for humanity is ha-Adam. Adam technically isn't a name, it's the Hebrew word for a human being. It doesn't have to be a man, it can be any gender. So in Genesis 1:27, when God creates people male and female, I as a non-binary person might get nervous hearing that, but we don't have to hold that as a binary and. Just like God created the sea and the land, and there's tide in between that, and plants and animals. We know there are things that don't fit into category of animal or plant, there's fungi and stuff. And so with ha-Adam, we have this idea that God creates people with different physical features. We all are created in diverse ways, and that includes sexual characteristics. But the idea of gender, a gendered term like man or woman, ish or isha, is not introduced until Genesis 2:23. And then the character Adam, ha-Adam, is the one who introduces it. He names himself Ish, a man, and names Eve, Isha, a woman. So to me, he kind of decided a gender for himself and for Eve, which is problematic. But, the idea that humans are the ones who kind of came up with those, and we are within our rights to kind of look beyond gender the way it's assigned to us today. And then sticking in Genesis is a character you might not be as familiar with, Hagar. So she is the slave woman of Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 16. So Sarah was unable to bear a child, and she told Abraham, go lie with Hagar and have a baby through Hagar. And so Hagar wasn't asked whether she wanted to have a baby, obviously, and so she became pregnant. And while she was pregnant, Sarah was jealous.
Because so much of women's worth at that point in time was in their ability to have a child, and whether or not they had many children, particularly sons.
Makes me think of The Handmaid's Tale, if any of y'all have watched that lately. But anyway, Dolores Williams is a first-generation womanist scholar, so a black woman theologian, who wrote about Hagar and how black Christian women can really relate to this woman, because Hagar was abused by her master and her mistress. She ran away into the desert while pregnant, and so she's sitting there and God visits her. God says, go back to your mistress and submit to her. To go back into this abusive, oppressive, enslaved situation. And that is hard to deal with. But God also promises her that her son Ishmael is going to have tons of descendants. And so Hagar has the hope she needs to go back into the situation in which she is oppressed, because at this point she doesn't have another choice. And so she names God, which is a really special thing, that she speaks to God and says, I'm going to call you El Roi, which means God sees. Because one, she saw God and lived, and two, God saw her. She didn't think of God as her God. She saw God as the God of her oppressors. Just as many LGBT Christians who are kind of working through faith issues might see God as the God of our oppressors, the ones who tell us we don't belong. But God sees us. God sees us in these situations, and sometimes we don't get out of them right away. Sometimes we're in the closet and we're stuck with homophobic parents or other family members, bosses or classmates. but God is with us. God sees us, and God promises that there's hope to come. So one more from me, and then I'll finally pass it on to Leah, sorry. In Genesis 32, the figure Jacob wrestles with God. A man comes to him, and they wrestle until dawn. And Jacob is strong enough that this figure, who we learn is an angel or God, it's unclear, it's ambiguous. And finally, this figure breaks Jacob's hip. And Jacob still says, I'm not going to stop fighting until you bless me. And so the figure blesses him and renames him Israel. And so as a queer Christian, this story is important to me in two ways. One, it shows us that we can wrestle with God. Just like when we read the Psalms and we hear the psalmist kind of yelling at God, expressing frustration, here we see Jacob physically wrestling God. That we have this right. When we have questions and doubts and frustration, we can bring it to God. We don't have to be scared to. And secondly, as a non-binary trans Christian, Jacob gets renamed Israel. He's gone through this situation where he has been so changed that he needs a new name. And to me, that's a powerful thing. When I decided to change my name, I thought of this story.
All right, so the next is my favorite. Yeah. This one is David and Jonathan. Mm-hmm. And I do think it is probably the most, I'm going to say blatant is not the word I'm looking for. It's probably the most easily backed up, like conjecture as far as the relationship between David and Jonathan being not straight.
Very much so.
And so part of that comes from when David speaks to Saul, the king. Jonathan is there, and Jonathan is the son of the king.
Yeah.
And while David is speaking, the soul of Jonathan, it says, was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And they made a very binding covenant between the two of them. And I know a lot of people have always framed this as being just like a really, really great friendship.
Very
like,
good friends.
Like we're close. They're just really close.
Yeah, and that's fair, like we're not saying platonic relationships are not important, but we see it as more as a romantic one for these two.
And when it comes to, somebody put it this way, if you replaced David's name and said like the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of Miriam and Jonathan loved her as his own soul, that would be read as a romantic relationship. And the article I was reading said that by now we'd have several Hollywood adaptations of their love.
Oh, yeah.
I think, which is probably very true.
I mean, especially because David moves in with Jonathan,
which is unprecedented.
Yeah.
He is a political threat to the king, and no one moves into the palace that isn't related in some way, like familially, to the royal family, to the king. And then later on in 2 Samuel, Jonathan eventually is killed in battle alongside his father Saul, the king. And when David is kind of giving Saul and Jonathan's eulogy publicly, he says of Jonathan, your love for me was more wonderful than that of any woman. So he's comparing the love that he and Jonathan had to being as more wonderful than the relationships that he had with his many wives and concubines. Yeah. So I've always liked to see David as bisexual, partially because I am, but also because I
mean, he definitely liked some of those women, like Bathsheba, so which is sort of infamous example. Yeah. So Esther, we both love Esther, right? Who doesn't love Esther? She is badass. So at my seminary, for our more light service, the book of Esther was our theme. And so we all took a chapter from Esther and talked about various things. And most of them had to do with being in the closet or coming out. Because Esther is, when she becomes the queen, she is hiding the fact that she is Jewish in order to protect herself. But she chooses to come out because, as her cousin Mordecai says, perhaps God put you here for just a time as this. And she manages to save all her people, which is pretty cool. Again, for those who are in the closet, you can definitely relate to Esther because she knows that experience, that terror, and that feeling of kind of helplessness when you are surrounded by homophobia or transphobia and you can't speak up and say something about it because it would be a danger to you. And then also when you do make the decision to come out, she knows that too. And then, I mean, there's a lot of really cool women in the Hebrew Bible, and one pair I'm sure you all know and love is Ruth and Naomi.
So, Naomi and her husband moved to Moab, and their children married there. So when tragedy struck and her husband and all of her sons died, Naomi was going to move back to Israel. And one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, wanted to come with her. And that is interesting because she was moving from a place that was her home to a place where she knew she would not be accepted probably by the people around her. But in chapter 1, verse 14, Ruth clung to Naomi and said, "Where you go, I go. Your people will be my people and your God, my God." And I've just always thought that was such it's so powerful on any level. The willingness to give up pretty much everything just to be with this person and go where they go.
Also, that word clung, so Ruth clung to Naomi, that's the same Hebrew verb as the one used back in Genesis, where it says of Adam and Eve that they cling together, or for this reason a man goes and clings to his wife. So it can be used with sexual connotation, not that it has to here. It's definitely that clinging is very intimate, whatever it might mean. These two women are very vulnerable. Israel is not a place where two women can live alone without a man to kind of defend them and keep them safe. That's just the world they lived in. So they find Ruth a new husband, Boaz. And so by chapter 4, things have been resolved. Ruth is married. And they also raise the son that Ruth has, Obed. They raise him together. In many ways, they're kind of both his mother, in that when Ruth has him, she puts Obed on Naomi's lap, and Naomi's the one that nurses him. And the women in the neighborhood say that a son has been born to Naomi, not to Ruth. They say, "Oh, this is Naomi's son," replacing the one she lost, and also showing that these two women had that close relationship and that they're raising a son together. So they're pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then another figure
is you say it, pronounce it.
Well, in Hebrew it's Yael.
Yael.
But you can say Jael.
It's how it's spelled,
or Jael, you know.
While the fighting is taking place, the leader of the enemy army ends up near Jael's tent, near her home. And she invites him in with food and hospitality, and eventually he falls asleep, and she drives a tent peg through his temple all the way into the ground and kills him. It's pretty intense, but I love it because she is not going to stand by and let them take advantage of her, or let them, kill, pillage, and plunder her people.
And again, so these are women who I think LGBT plus people can relate to, because we often break society's expectations, and it takes a lot of courage and sometimes a lot of risk.
All right, so that brings us to the New Testament.
Ooh. All right, and to start off, we'll do a figure you may have heard of, Jesus. Yeah. I'm sorry, that was a bad joke.
That was so corny.
Okay, anyway, Jesus. The Gospels don't really mention whether or not he was married, and so we can kind of guess he probably wasn't, since he was always running around with a bunch of guys. In his time period, you were expected to get married, to have offspring, and so Jesus not doing that, I feel like, can really resonate with those of us who either are asexual and aromantic, so we don't desire that kind of relationship at all, or else we're in a relationship, like the two of us, we probably won't have kids. So breaking a lot of societal expectations. And then some people also see him as being in a romantic relationship with the figure that the Gospels call the beloved disciple. So we're going to include in a post with a lot of resources. We'll include more where you can read about this theory.
So this next one is in both Matthew 8 and Luke 7, and it's the centurion who comes to Jesus to ask him to heal his servant. And
yeah, okay, so servant, the word is the Greek word pais, which can mean servant, but often commonly means boy, so you can also translate it like that, a boy or a child. This word pais can, less often, but it can mean in Greek texts, the young male lover of an older male. And within the soldier world of Rome, that's not an impossibility. So it's very possible that the centurion and his boy were in a relationship. Now, we want to, give the disclaimer that obviously today this kind of relationship wouldn't be okay, because the Roman soldier would have been quite a bit deal older than the servant would have been.
Also the power dynamic between being a servant and being a centurion.
So yeah, this is definitely not something we would condone. But the kind of point of the story is that Jesus isn't worried about sexuality when he chooses to heal this boy. He doesn't ask, well, wait, have you two done sex? Because if so, I don't think I want to heal this boy.
Done sex.
Yes, done the do. Jesus doesn't say that. He doesn't mention that at all.
Initially, Jesus is like, okay, take me to him. I'll go heal him. And the centurion says, I'm not worried that you should come under my roof. You can heal him like right where you are. And he does, because he's so impressed by his great faith.
Yeah. So the point of that is that regardless of our sexuality, we can show faith, we can practice faith, and Jesus isn't worried about that,
And that reminds me, again, going back to David and Jonathan, David is called by God a man after God's own heart. So if he was indeed in a relationship with Jonathan in any sort of way, like, that's just heartening for me to hear that this person who is like me in this one way was considered, to be someone after God's own heart.
Yeah, that is really powerful.
All right, so our next one you may also have heard of is
possibly.
Paul. And this one comes from a lot of his statements, especially in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he says that is better not to get married, and that he wishes that more people were like him in whatever way that means, whether that means singleness or possibly asexuality or being aromantic.
Right. But he says, this is just my opinion. God's not telling me this. So not to say if you want to be in a relationship, if you want to get married, that you can't. You totally can. And this was just Paul's opinion. But it is cool to see Paul very well could have been asexual and or aromantic.
Now this next one is from Acts chapter 8. And it is the story of Philip meeting a eunuch from Ethiopia in the desert. And Philip is traveling down this road, and he sees a caravan and a eunuch in kind of, I've always pictured the things, maybe it's just from movies, that like people carry on their shoulders. I don't know why. But, and he was a court official of the Queen of Ethiopia, and he was in charge of her entire treasury, so he was very important. He had come to Jerusalem to worship. He was reading from Isaiah out loud.
Now, something I like about Isaiah, so this Ethiopian eunuch, and note that he was Ethiopian, he was black, just to get that out there, like another marginalization for him, because as a eunuch, he also was marginalized in many ways in that he didn't fit into the gender binary of male and female. He would have either been naturally like infertile or castrated as a youth. And some people also speculate possibly gay. So he occupied this special space in society. And within the book of Isaiah in chapter 56, I like to imagine he was reading from that area of Isaiah, because in that chapter, God offers this hope for eunuchs that if you're faithful, then I will write your name in the temple, and you will have a legacy more lasting than children. So it's this powerful thing for eunuchs who at other points weren't always treated so well. And Philip comes up to him. He asks Philip to kind of explain it in more detail to him, because I think he knows that Philip is a disciple and has kind of studied these things, and so they talk about it. They have a discussion, and Philip tells him of Jesus and tells him all of these things. Eventually, they come to water, and the eunuch says, "Look, there's water. What's to stop me from being baptized?" And Philip doesn't blink at that. He's like, "Awesome, this is great!" And he baptizes him right there along the road. And he just replied, "If you believe with all of your heart, you may." So for us, that question of what is to prevent me from being baptized, we might ask as LGBT Christians, what is to prevent me from being saved, from going to church, from having a relationship with Jesus? And the answer is nothing. Not other people, not what they think about us. Just believe and have trust. And not to say your faith has to be perfect, but to have trust that God loves you and is going to accept you. And like the eunuch, whatever your gender is or your sexuality may be, have that hope.
All right, that about does it for this. Like Avery said, we're going to do a much longer and more detailed post on each of these on our Tumblr, especially there are some details that just didn't quite fit for time. And if there's anybody that we left out, you could message us and tell us, and we will add them to our post.
Absolutely. That would be cool. So thanks for listening.
Yeah, see you later.